Power only works when no one questions it. The rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of the restaurant, a steady rhythm beneath the low hum of quiet conversations and clinking glasses. And at table 12, Ethan Caldwell signed his name on a document worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime, without even glancing up, his silver pen moving with practiced precision as if the outcome had already been decided long before the ink touched paper. Because in his world, it usually was, control wasn't something he earned. It was something he assumed, something people gave him without realizing they had a choice. And when Clara Whitmore approached the table, balancing a tray with 2 glasses of sparkling water, she saw it instantly. Not the money, not the suit, not the polished confidence, but the pattern, the quiet expectation that everything around him would bend, just slightly, to his will. She set the glasses down with steady hands, her movements unhurried, measured, like someone who understood timing better than most. And for a brief moment, a single drop of water slid from the rim of the glass onto the white linen, small, almost invisible, but enough. Ethan paused, his pen hovering midair, his eyes lifting for the first time, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge something had disrupted the perfect line of his evening. "Careful," he said, his tone calm, but edged with something colder, something that expected correction without needing to demand it. Clara didn't apologize. She didn't rush to wipe it away. Instead, she reached for a cloth and dabbed the spot gently, as if it had never been a mistake to begin with. "Of course," she replied softly, her voice even, professional, but there was something in it, something that didn't quite match the usual rhythm of compliance he was used to hearing, something steady, something self-contained. Ethan watched her for half a second longer than necessary, not because of the spill, but because she didn't move like the others. There was no urgency to please, no subtle tension in her shoulders, no quick glance to read his mood. She simply finished what she was doing and stepped back, as if the moment had already passed, and that was when he noticed it, not consciously at first, just a flicker of curiosity beneath his usual certainty, because people like Clara weren't supposed to exist in places like this, not in his orbit, not in his carefully structured environments where every interaction had a predictable outcome. He leaned back slightly, setting the pen down, the signed contract now forgotten for a moment, and glanced at the empty chair across from him, then back at her. "Stay," he said, casually, as if the word itself carried enough weight to make it inevitable, as if it always had. Clara paused, just for a second, not frozen, not uncertain, just still, like someone considering a detail others would overlook. Then she turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze directly for the first time, her expression calm, unreadable, and in that brief silence, something subtle shifted, not in the room, not in the air, but in the space between them, something that didn't belong to him, something he couldn't immediately define. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell wasn't entirely sure what would happen next. Clara did not sit immediately, and that alone was enough to create a ripple, subtle but real, because in Ethan Caldwell's world, hesitation was rare and almost always strategic, never quiet, never unspoken. And yet here it was, standing just a few feet from him in the form of a waitress who seemed entirely unaffected by the weight of his presence. She adjusted the edge of the table slightly, aligning the fork with a precision that suggested habit rather than performance. Then she reached for the check presenter resting near his hand and placed it gently in the center of the table, not as an offer, not as a signal to end the meal, but as something else entirely, something that reframed the moment without announcing it. "Your timing seems important," she said, her voice calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were observing rather than responding. Ethan watched her more closely now, the faintest crease forming between his brows. Not irritation, not yet, but interest, the kind that came when a pattern did not behave the way it should. "It is," he replied, leaning back slightly, his tone measured, controlled. "Everything runs on timing." Clara nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. And then, without asking permission, she pulled the empty chair out just enough to rest her hand on the back of it, not sitting, not refusing, simply existing in the space between the two, a space Ethan was not used to sharing. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping against the glass in uneven rhythms, and inside, the low, Conversations continued, but something around table 12 had shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a current changing direction beneath still water. Sit. Ethan said again, softer this time, but with a sharper edge, as if repeating the word would restore its usual effect. Clara met his eyes again, steady, unhurried, and for a brief second, there was no movement at all, no sound beyond the rain and the distant clink of silverware. And then she sat, but not in the way he expected. She did not lean in, did not soften her posture, did not signal availability or compliance. Instead, she positioned the chair so that the light from the window fell across her face while leaving his slightly shadowed. A small detail, easy to miss, but not accidental. Ethan felt it before he understood it, the subtle shift in perspective, the way the angle changed what could be seen and what could not. 5 minutes, he said, reaching into his jacket and placing a folded stack of bills on the table beside the check presenter, not pushing it forward, just letting it exist there, visible, undeniable, more than you would make in a week. Clara glanced at the money, then back at him, her expression unchanged, no surprise, no temptation, just a quiet acknowledgement of what it represented. I am already being paid, she said simply, and the words landed differently than he expected, not defiant, not dismissive, just complete, as if the transaction he was offering had already been considered and found unnecessary. Ethan studied her face, searching for something familiar, some sign of calculation or desire, but there was none, only that same steady presence, the same calm distance that made it impossible to predict her next move. And for the first time in a long while, he realized he was no longer directing the interaction. He was participating in it, reacting to it. And he did not like the feeling, not because it threatened him, but because it was unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things required attention. Then consider it a conversation, he said, adjusting his tone, refining the approach, as he always did. I am curious. Clara tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the word. Then she looked past him for a moment, scanning the room, the other tables, the quiet movements of staff and guests, and when her gaze returned, there was something new in it. Not challenge, not resistance, but clarity, the kind that came from seeing something exactly as it was. Curiosity is not control, she said softly, and the silence that followed was different now, heavier, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been revealed, something small, almost invisible, but enough to change the balance, enough to make Ethan Caldwell pause before his next move. The rain grew louder, pressing against the windows as if the night itself was leaning in to listen, and for a moment, Ethan said nothing, which in itself was unusual, because silence had always been something he controlled, something he used, never something he stepped into without purpose. But now it lingered between them, shaped not by him, but by her, and he could feel it, the subtle shift in balance. The way the conversation no longer moved in straight lines. You think this is about control, he said finally, his voice calm but tighter now, more deliberate, as if each word needed to land exactly where he intended. Clara did not answer right away. She rested her hands lightly on the table, not defensive, not closed, just present, and when she spoke, it was with the same quiet clarity that had unsettled him before. I think you are used to being listened to, she said, and there was no accusation in her tone, only observation, which somehow carried more weight. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to show focus, not anger, but precision, the way he looked at numbers, at negotiations, at anything that required breaking down, understanding, mastering. And you are not listening, he replied, almost a statement, almost a question. Clara's gaze did not waver. I am, she said softly, just not the way you expect. And that was it. That was the line that shifted something deeper, because expectation was where his power lived, in the predictability of human behavior, in the patterns people followed without realizing it. And she was not following any of them. He reached for the glass of water, taking a slow sip, buying himself a second to recalibrate, something he had done countless times in boardrooms and negotiations. But this felt different. There was no leverage here, no clear outcome to steer toward, only a conversation that refused to behave. Do you know who I am? He asked, not out of ego, not entirely, but as a way to re-establish ground. to bring the moment back into something familiar. Clara glanced briefly at the contract still resting near his hand, the signature bold and unmistakable, then back at him. Yes, she said, simple, direct, and it does not change this moment. The words landed quietly, but they carried a finality that was difficult to ignore. Ethan felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not frustration, but resistance, not from her actions, but from her perspective, because she was not rejecting him. She was removing the weight of what he represented, and that was something he could not negotiate with. He exhaled slowly, leaning back again, his posture still composed, but the certainty behind it slightly less rigid. Most people would take the offer, he said, nodding subtly toward the money still resting untouched on the table. Clara followed his glance, then returned her attention to him. Most people are trying to get somewhere, she replied, and there was a pause, just long enough for the meaning to settle. I already am. Ethan studied her again, more carefully now, not looking for weakness, but for understanding, because there was something in her words that did not align with the environment around them. The polished surfaces, the quiet luxury, the unspoken hierarchy. She did not seem to belong to any of it, and yet she moved through it with ease, without resistance, without attachment, and that made her difficult to place, difficult to influence. The rain softened slightly, the rhythm changing, and inside, a server passed by their table, casting a brief glance at the scene before quickly looking away, sensing something they did not fully understand. Ethan noticed it too, the awareness from others, the subtle attention. And for the first time, he realized he was no longer the center of control in the room. The focus had shifted, not loudly, not obviously, but enough that he could feel it. You are very certain, he said, his voice quieter now, less commanding, more measured. Clara's expression softened just a fraction, not in submission, but in understanding. No, she said, almost gently, just not uncertain. And in that distinction, something else gave way, something small but significant, because uncertainty was where influence began, and she had just made it clear that she was not offering him that opening. Not now, not at all. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the stillness between them no longer felt like a pause, but like a decision waiting to be made, not by force, not by pressure, but by something quieter, something that did not need to announce itself. Ethan's fingers tapped lightly once against the table, a habit he had not noticed in years, a subtle rhythm that usually meant calculation, but now it felt out of place, unnecessary, as if the usual strategies he relied on were arriving too late to matter. You speak like someone who has seen this before, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge it carried earlier, not because he intended to soften, but because the moment required something different. Clara glanced toward the window, watching a thin stream of rain trace its way down the glass, her reflection faint beside it. Then she looked back at him. I have, she answered, and there was no elaboration, no attempt to impress, just a simple truth that did not need to be expanded. Ethan leaned forward slightly again, but this time the movement was slower, more deliberate, as if he were stepping into unfamiliar ground rather than claiming it. And you walked away from it, he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion drawn from the way she carried herself, the absence of urgency, the lack of need. Clara's lips curved just enough to suggest recognition, not amusement, not quite agreement. I stopped mistaking it for something it was not, she replied, and the words lingered, not because they were dramatic, but because they quietly redefined everything he had been assuming. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the contract in front of him, the signature still fresh, the ink not yet fully set, a document that represented control, certainty, outcome, and yet, sitting across from Clara, it felt strangely distant, as if it belonged to a different version of the evening, one that had already passed. And what do you think it is? He asked, almost carefully now, the question carrying less authority and more curiosity than before. Clara did not answer immediately. She reached for the water glass, adjusted it slightly so that the condensation no longer touched the edge of the paper beneath it, a small action, precise, intentional. Then she met his eyes again. A habit, she said softly. One that works, until it does not. Ethan let out a quiet breath, something close to a laugh, but without the humor, because there was a part of him that recognized the truth in that, not in theory, but in experience. Moments where control had slipped, where outcomes had not followed the script, but he had always managed to recover, to reassert, to adapt. And yet this felt different, not because he was losing anything tangible, but because there was nothing to take back, nothing to reclaim. The shift had happened in a place he could not reach. "You think this is one of those moments," he said. Watching her closely, Clara tilted her head slightly, considering, then shook it once, gently. "No," she said. "I think this is one of the moments where you realize you never had as much control as you believed." The words did not land like a challenge. They landed like a quiet observation, one that did not demand agreement, only recognition, and that made it harder to dismiss. Ethan sat back fully now, his posture still composed, but something in it had changed, something less rigid, less certain. His eyes moved briefly around the room, noticing details he had ignored earlier, the way conversations flowed without him, the way people existed without needing his presence to define the space. And when his gaze returned to Clara, there was no immediate response, no quick correction, just a pause that stretched a second longer than usual. Because for the first time that evening, he was not preparing his next move. He was reconsidering the game itself. The air between them settled into something quieter, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but not resolved either. And that was what made it unfamiliar. Ethan Caldwell had spent years navigating rooms where outcomes were clear long before conversations ended. But this was different. This was a moment that did not point anywhere, did not demand anything. And yet it held his attention more firmly than any negotiation he had ever led. His gaze drifted once more to the money resting beside the check presenter, untouched, unchanged, as if it had never carried the weight he was used to assigning to it. "You have not asked a single question," he said, his voice steady but softer now, almost reflective. Clara followed his glance briefly, then returned her focus to him. "I did not need to," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more meaning than a longer explanation ever could. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning his elbow against the arm of the chair, his posture no longer signaling control, but presence, a subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed by most, but not by her. Most people would want something, he continued, not as an accusation, but as an observation he was trying to understand. Clara's eyes held his, calm, unwavering. "They usually do," she said, and there was a pause, just long enough for him to realize she was not including herself in that statement. The rain outside began to ease, the steady rhythm softening into a lighter pattern, and inside the restaurant, the energy shifted with it. Conversations grew slightly louder, movement more fluid, as if the world beyond their table was continuing without interruption. Ethan noticed it now, the way everything moved independently of him, not influenced, not directed, just existing. And for a moment, that realization stayed with him. "And you do not," he said, the words quieter than before, almost careful. Clara tilted her head slightly, considering, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shake. "Not in the way you mean," she answered, and something about that distinction lingered, because it suggested depth without revealing it, purpose without exposing it. Ethan's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the contract again, but this time the gesture felt absent, automatic, as if it belonged to an earlier version of himself that had not yet adjusted to the present moment. "Then why stay?" he asked, not challenging, not commanding, just asking. And that alone marked a change. Clara glanced down briefly, her hand resting near the check presenter, then she looked back up, her expression unchanged, but her voice carried something new, something quieter, more grounded. "Because leaving would be easier," she said, and the words settled into the space between them with a different kind of weight, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable. Ethan studied her more closely now, not searching for leverage, not analyzing for advantage, but trying to understand something that did not fit into the frameworks he knew. "And you do not choose easy," he said, more to himself than to her. Clara's gaze softened just a fraction, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Easy does not change anything," she replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence returning, but no longer uncertain, no longer contested. It was simply there, steady, grounded, and in that silence, Ethan Caldwell realized something he had not considered before. That control was not always taken, not always lost. Sometimes it was simply not given. And when that happened, there was nothing to reclaim, nothing to negotiate, only a quiet recognition of what had never truly belonged to him in the first place. The moment did not break, it deepened, and Ethan Caldwell felt it in a way that was unfamiliar, not as pressure, not as resistance, but as a quiet absence of something he had always relied on. His influence, his presence, the subtle force that usually shaped conversations before they even began. And yet here, sitting across from Clara Whitmore, none of it seemed to apply. He glanced once more at the money on the table. Then, without thinking, he reached forward and slid it slightly toward the check presenter, not offering it, not withdrawing it, just removing it from the center of the moment. And that small action carried more meaning than anything he had said so far, Clara noticed. But she did not react. She simply watched, the same calm expression, the same steady awareness that made it impossible to read her beyond what she chose to show. "You changed it," she said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. Ethan looked at his hand for a second, then back at her. "It was distracting," he replied, and for the first time, there was no attempt to frame the answer, no strategy behind the words, just a simple acknowledgement. Clara gave a slight nod, as if confirming something she had already understood, and the silence returned again. But now it felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, just clear, like a space that no longer needed to be filled. Ethan leaned back, his shoulders relaxing just enough to be noticeable, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, he was not performing, not projecting, not managing perception. He was simply there, present in a way that did not require control. "You said it was a habit," he continued, his voice quieter, more reflective. "What made you see it that way?" Clara's gaze shifted briefly to the window, where the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, the droplets now spaced farther apart, less urgent. Then she looked back at him. "Because it repeats," she said. "Different people, different rooms, same pattern." Ethan nodded slightly, the logic of it familiar, almost obvious, and yet he had never framed it that way, not in terms of repetition, not in terms of something that could be observed from the outside. "And you stepped out of it," he said, again not asking, just following the line of thought. Clara's expression remained steady, but there was a faint shift in her eyes, something quieter, more distant. "I stopped participating in it," she corrected, and that distinction settled into him slowly, because it implied something deeper, not escape, not avoidance, but choice, deliberate, consistent, unshaken by circumstance. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting across the room again. But this time he was not measuring it, not assessing value or influence. He was simply seeing it, the way people spoke without urgency, the way moments passed without being controlled or optimized. And when he looked back at Clara, there was no immediate response waiting, no prepared line, just a quiet recognition forming. "And if someone tries to pull you back into it," he said, his tone almost thoughtful now. Clara tilted her head slightly, considering, then gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "They can try," she said, "but it only works if I agree to it." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not need emphasis, because in that moment, Ethan understood something that had never been presented to him so clearly before. That control was not something he imposed, it was something others allowed, often without realizing it. And when that allowance disappeared, so did the illusion. He sat there for a second longer, absorbing the thought, not resisting it, not reshaping it, just letting it exist. And in that stillness, something shifted again, not in the room, not in her, but in him, subtle, quiet, but real enough that when he finally spoke, his voice no longer carried the same certainty it had before. "That is different," he said, and Clara met his gaze, calm as ever. "No," she replied softly. "It just feels different when you are not the one holding it." The words settled slowly, not with resistance, but with recognition, and Ethan Caldwell did not respond immediately, which by itself marked a shift more significant than anything he had said so far, because silence had always been something he used to control outcomes, to create pressure, to guide responses. But now it existed without purpose, without direction, and he allowed it, his gaze resting on Clara not as a challenge, not as a calculation, but as something closer to understanding. "Then what does holding it look like?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter, stripped of the certainty it once carried. Clara did not answer right away. She glanced briefly at the table, at the contract, at the glass, at the small details that had once defined the interaction. Then she looked back at him. "It does not look like anything," she said softly. "That is why it is easy to mistake." Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing the answer, because it removed the structure he was used to relying on. There was no visible marker, no clear sign, nothing to identify or measure, and without those, his usual instincts had nothing to work with. "So it cannot be seen," he said, more to himself than to her. Clara shook her head gently. "It can," she replied, "just not by the person trying to use it." And that distinction lingered, because it explained something he had felt but could not define: the subtle resistance, the absence of response, the way the conversation had shifted without confrontation, without refusal, without anything he could push against. Ethan's fingers rested loosely on the table now, no longer tapping, no longer signaling thought or impatience, just still, as if the need to fill the space had faded. "And you see it," he said, looking at her more directly now. Clara held his gaze, calm, steady. "I notice it," she corrected. And there was a quiet humility in the wording, not claiming ownership, not asserting superiority, just acknowledging awareness, the kind that did not need to be proven. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting once more toward the window, where the rain had nearly stopped, leaving only faint traces on the glass, like something that had passed without needing to be announced. And when he looked back at her, there was no urgency left in his expression, no need to reclaim anything that had shifted. "Most people would call that power," he said, the word carrying less weight now, less certainty. Clara's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "Most people confuse the two," she replied. And again, the distinction was quiet, but it held. Ethan nodded once. The movement small, but deliberate, because for the first time, he was not trying to define the moment. He was allowing it to exist without needing to name it, and that alone changed the way it felt. "And what do you call it?" he asked, not demanding, not expecting, just asking. Clara paused, her eyes softening just enough to suggest consideration. Then she spoke, her voice steady, clear. "Choice," she said. And the word did not echo, did not expand. It simply settled, complete in its simplicity. Ethan repeated it silently in his mind, not as a concept, but as a realization, because it reframed everything, not as something he had lost, but as something he had never truly possessed. And in that understanding, there was no urgency to respond, no need to correct, only a quiet acceptance forming, subtle but undeniable. And for a moment, he simply sat there, no longer trying to lead, no longer trying to follow, just present in a space where control no longer defined the outcome. And strangely, that absence did not feel like loss, it felt like clarity. The word lingered in the air between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just present, and somehow that made it harder to ignore. Ethan Caldwell did not respond right away, not because he did not have something to say, but because for the first time, saying something felt unnecessary. His gaze remained on Clara, but it was different now, no longer measuring, no longer assessing, just observing, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a role, not as a position, but as a person who had stepped outside a system he had never questioned. The restaurant around them continued as it always had, quiet conversations, soft laughter, the occasional clink of glass against glass, but none of it reached the space they occupied. That space had become something separate, something self-contained. Clara glanced toward the table behind him for a brief moment, acknowledging a subtle signal from another server, then returned her attention to him, her posture unchanged, composed, grounded. "Your meeting is finished," she said gently, not reminding, not directing, simply stating what was already true. Ethan followed her glance, his eyes landing on the contract again, the signature now dry, the outcome secured, something that should have mattered more than anything else that evening. And yet it did not carry the same weight it had only minutes ago. "It is," he replied, his voice quieter, almost distant, as if the importance of it had shifted somewhere beyond his reach. Clara reached for the check presenter, adjusting it slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table in the same careful way she had done with everything else, small, precise, intentional movements that never asked for attention but always carried meaning. Then there is nothing left to control here, she said softly, and the sentence was simple, but it landed with a clarity that made it feel complete. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, not searching for contradiction, not resisting the statement, just letting it exist as it was, and in that moment, he realized something subtle but undeniable, that she was not ending the interaction, she was releasing it, removing the structure that had held it in place, allowing it to become something else entirely, something without direction, without expectation, something that did not belong to him or to her, but simply existed for as long as it needed to. "And you are comfortable with that?" he said, not challenging, just confirming. Clara met his gaze, her expression steady, her voice quiet. "I do not need it to be anything else," she answered, and there was no hesitation, no second thought, just a calm certainty that did not require validation. Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture that no longer carried tension, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to move the moment forward, to extract something from it, to define its purpose. Instead, he let it settle, the silence returning once more, but now it felt different again, lighter, clearer, like a space that had been emptied of expectation, and in that space, something shifted inside him, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone, one that did not seek control. "You could have walked away earlier," he said. Clara nodded, slightly, acknowledging the truth of it. "I could have," she replied, and there was a pause, brief but deliberate. "But then you would not have seen it." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried a quiet finality, because they revealed something that had not been obvious before, that this moment had never been about winning, never been about proving anything. It had been about showing, about allowing him to recognize something on his own, something that could not be forced, could not be explained, only experienced. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in agreement, not in surrender, but in understanding, and for the first time that evening, that felt like enough. Clara stood up first, not abruptly, not as a signal of ending, but as a natural continuation of the moment, as if the conversation had already reached its conclusion long before either of them acknowledged it. She adjusted the chair back into place with the same quiet precision, her movements unchanged from the beginning, steady, unhurried, untouched by anything that had shifted between them. Ethan remained seated for a second longer, watching her, not with the sharp focus he had used before, but with something quieter, something closer to reflection, as if he were trying to hold on to a detail he knew could not be forced to stay. "Clara," he said, and this time her name did not sound like a command or a strategy. It sounded like recognition. She paused, turning back slightly, her expression calm, open, not expecting anything, not resisting anything, just present. "Yes," she replied softly, and the simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than any of the words that had come before. Ethan glanced briefly at the check presenter, then at the contract, then back at her, as if considering whether any of it still mattered in the way it had when the evening began. "Thank you," he said, and the words were not formal, not rehearsed. They were quiet, deliberate, and for the first time, entirely free of expectation. Clara held his gaze for a moment, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging it for what it was. "You are welcome," she answered, her tone unchanged, as if gratitude did not alter the balance, only clarified it. And with that, she turned and stepped away, returning to the rhythm of the restaurant as if nothing had happened, as if the moment they had shared did not need to be carried forward to remain real. Ethan watched her go, the way she moved through the room without drawing attention, without seeking it, yet somehow shifting the space around her simply by being present, and for a brief second, he considered calling her back, asking something else, extending the moment just a little longer, but he did not because he could not, but because he understood that doing so would pull it back into something it no longer was, something controlled, something defined. And that was no longer the point. He reached for the check, signing it without looking at the amount, not out of habit this time, but because the number felt irrelevant. Then he stood, adjusting his jacket with a movement that was slower than usual, less precise. As if the need for perfection had softened, the restaurant door opened as he stepped outside. The air cool, the rain reduced to a faint mist that lingered in the streetlights. And for a moment, he paused, looking back through the glass, not at the room, not at the people, but at the reflection staring back at him. Something subtle had changed, not in his position, not in his success, but in the way he understood both. And it did not feel like loss, it felt like clarity. Quiet, unspoken, but unmistakable. He turned and walked away without checking his phone, without rushing to the next meeting, without reclaiming the rhythm that had defined his days, because for the first time, he was not trying to stay ahead of anything. He was simply moving forward, and inside, Clara continued her work, pouring water, clearing tables, speaking softly to guests. Nothing about her had changed, nothing needed to, because the shift had never been hers to make, it had only been hers to reveal. And somewhere between the rain and the silence, between the question and the answer, something simple had become clear. Power does not disappear when it is challenged, it disappears when it